parents abandoned me for my brother and destroyed our family. Growing up, I always thought family was about loyalty and respect, an unbreakable bond that transcended the small battles and disagreements of daily life. My brother, Kyle, and I, despite our differences, used to have each other's backs. But as we grew older, the unwavering favoritism from our parents began to twist our relationship into something unrecognizable. Kyle was the golden child. Everyone in the family knew it, though they pretended it wasn't true. From as early as I can remember, he was the one who got the best toys, the new clothes, the extra attention. My parents spared no expense to make sure he had every opportunity, while I was left to figure things out on my own. I was always too independent or the strong one who didn't need coddling. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I didn't need their validation or their favoritism, but even so, it stung. I worked tirelessly through school, saved up money on my own, and eventually moved out as soon as I turned 18. I wanted freedom more than anything, and I thought that leaving would finally bring me some peace. But in a cruel twist, it turned out that being away only made things worse. When I was 25, I finally managed to buy my own home, a cozy little bungalow on the outskirts of town. It was nothing extravagant, but it was mine. My hard work and sacrifices had paid off, and for the first time I felt proud of myself. My parents, however, were less than enthusiastic. They barely acknowledged my achievement. Instead, they were fixated on Kyle, who was still trying to find his footing in life. While I was busy building my career and making something of myself, Kyle had taken a different path. He was always looking for the next big thrill, changing jobs, picking up new hobbies, and generally bouncing around aimlessly. My parents, however, supported every venture, financially and emotionally, even when it inevitably fell apart. They kept telling him he was special, and it was only a matter of time before he found his true calling. A few weeks after I moved into my new home, my parents came to visit for the first time. They looked around, nodding in approval at the house, though it seemed forced. Mom's words still haunt me. "It's nice, but a little small, don't you think?" And then, without a trace of irony, she added Kyle might be needing a place soon. Maybe he could stay here if things don't work out for him in his new job. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. They expected me to open my home, the one thing I'd achieved through my hard work and perseverance, to the brother they had coddled and enabled his whole life. For the sake of keeping the peace, I reluctantly agreed, hoping it would only be temporary. That was the beginning of a nightmare. Kyle moved in. It was as if he brought chaos with him. He wasn't exactly a model roommate, to put it mildly. He left messes everywhere, never paid for groceries, and treated my home like it was his personal playground. My complaints fell on deaf ears with my parents. They'd shrug and say, "Oh, he's just figuring things out. Give him some time." One night, after a particularly rough day at work, I came home to find Kyle hosting a party without my permission. Strangers filled my home, drinking, laughing, and creating a mess in every room. When I confronted him, he laughed it off, saying I was being uptight. That night, we had a massive argument, and I told him he had 2 weeks to move out. But instead of taking me seriously, Kyle went straight to our parents. The next day, my phone lit up with messages from Mom and Dad accusing me of being selfish, unsupportive, and ungrateful for the sacrifices they'd made. Mom even had the audacity to tell me I should be thankful Kyle would grace my small home with his presence. A few weeks later, my parents showed up unannounced. They sat me down and, without any preamble, asked me to sign over part of the house to Kyle. They argued it would be easier if he had stake in the place since he would be living there indefinitely. "I'm sorry, but no," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. Mom didn't even flinch. "Kyle has been struggling. As his family, it's our job to support him. You don't understand how hard he's had it." Dad just nodded in agreement, as if it was a given that I should hand over half of my life's work to my brother because he hadn't managed to get his own life together. I shook my head, holding back tears. When I was struggling, did anyone offer to help me? Did anyone suggest I take over half of something you owned? The room fell silent. I knew deep down this wasn't about fairness or family unity. It was just another way to ensure Kyle stayed at the center of their universe. And I realized with a sinking feeling that I would never be able to make them see the truth. A month passed, and I thought maybe they had finally accepted my answer. But I was wrong. One evening, Kyle came home with a letter in hand, a legal document. He was suing me for partial ownership of the house, claiming that it was promised to him by our parents. My own brother, enabled by my parents, was trying to legally take what I'd built from the ground up. The betrayal was overwhelming. I called my parents in a fury, demanding to know how they could support such a claim. But they just sighed, as if I were being difficult. "Family sacrifices for each other?" Dad said calmly. "You've been lucky and Kyle needs a break. We've always done everything we can for you both, but now it's time for you to return the favor." I hired a lawyer, and the case dragged on. Kyle and my parents stopped speaking to me except through legal channels. But one time I attempted to reach out, hoping to find some semblance of resolution. They responded with cold indifference. My own family, the people who should have been my support, had chosen my brother over me, over basic fairness, over decency. As the court date approached, I felt torn. Part of me wanted to fight tooth and nail to keep what was mine, to finally prove that I wasn't someone who could you walk over. Another part, a weary, defeated part, wanted to just give in. I was exhausted, drained by the constant battle for validation, for recognition, for respect. How had it come to this? One day, as I sat alone in my empty house, I made a decision. I was going to sell the house. If my parents and Kyle wanted it so badly, they could fight over the empty shell of what used to be my home. I didn't need it anymore. I'd start fresh, somewhere far from the toxic bonds that had held me down for so long. On the day I listed the house, I sent a simple message to my family. It's done. Good luck fighting over the scraps. I moved out the next day, leaving behind a lifetime of memories and a family that had chosen to abandon me for the sake of one entitled son. Where I would go from there, I didn't know. I knew one thing for certain: I would no longer be a part of their drama. Update 1. They're back, and they want more. It's been a few weeks since I walked away from the house and cut off all contact with my family. Selling the house was liberating, but also bittersweet. It had been my sanctuary, a place I'd built with my own hands and hard work, and leaving it behind felt like shedding part of myself. But it was worth it to be free of the constant demands, manipulation, and guilt. For a while, things were peaceful. I found a small apartment on the other side of town and started adjusting to life without the weight of my family's expectations hanging over me. I get a pang of sadness every now and then, especially thinking about the childhood memories Kyle and I shared before things got so bad. I kept reminding myself that walking away was the only way to protect my sanity. Then last night, the texts started coming in. First from my mom, then my dad, and eventually, even Kyle. I'd blocked most of their numbers after the move, but somehow they found a way to message me from unknown numbers. Mom's first message started innocently enough. Hope you're doing okay. A small part of me wanted to believe she'd come around, but maybe she was reaching out to mend things. But then she followed up with a long text explaining that Kyle had lost his job again. He'd really been struggling lately, she wrote, and without any real income, he couldn't afford his own place. They were worried sick about him and thought that maybe I could help. I didn't even respond to her first 2 messages, but then Dad sent one too. He was less subtle about his intentions. It's time to move past this childish feud and do what's right by family, he wrote. Your brother is out of options, and we can't take him in right now. But maybe if you're able to provide some financial support, he could get back on his feet. Reading it made my blood boil. It was as if they hadn't learned anything. I sold my home because they tried to take it from me, and now they had the nerve to ask for money. Took a deep breath, resisting the urge to fire back with something I'd regret. But it didn't stop there. My parents and Kyle kept sending messages throughout the evening, each one tugging at me in a different way. Kyle's messages were especially aggravating. Come on, man, just a little help, he wrote. You know they'll never let it go if you don't. Besides, I do the same for you. I laughed bitterly at that. Kyle had never done anything for me. It had always been me picking up the slack, me cleaning up after his messes. The golden child had been coddled his whole life, and now he was struggling without the safety net my parents had provided. I knew this wasn't about helping him get back on his feet. This was about him learning that actions have consequences, and I wasn't about to let him drag me down with him again. I finally replied, a simple message to all 3 of them. I don't owe you anything. Don't contact me again. That seemed to do the trick, at least for the next 24 hours. I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd take the hint. But then, this morning, I woke up to a different message. This one wasn't from any of them, but from a friend back in our old neighborhood. You might want to check us out, he texted, attaching a link to a local news article. My heart skipped a beat as I clicked on it. There, in bold letters, was a headline about a recent domestic disturbance report at my old address. It turns out that my parents and Kyle had gotten into a massive argument over the house and things got out of hand. Neighbors had called the police, and from what I could gather, Kyle had been arrested after smashing a window in a fit of rage. The details were fuzzy, but the gist was clear. Kyle was spiraling, and my parents were losing control of the golden child they'd worked so hard to enable. As much as I felt a pang of pity for them, I also felt a strange sense of relief. I wasn't there to clean up the mess this time, but a part of me can't help but wonder what they'll do next. They're relentless when it comes to Kyle, and I have a sinking feeling they'll try to reach out again. Maybe even try to twist things to make me feel guilty for not being there to help the family. For now, I'm holding my ground. I won't let them drag me back into their chaos. But knowing them, this isn't the end of it. Update 2. Twist in the tally. After the incident at the house and Kyle's arrest, I thought maybe my family would back off. Maybe they'd finally realize I wasn't coming back, wasn't going to swoop in and save the day. But as usual, I underestimated just how deep their entitlement ran. 2 weeks went by with blessed silence. I allowed myself to hope they'd finally accepted my decision. I'd begun to settle into my new life, relishing the absence of constant family drama, learning what it meant to finally have peace. But then, one afternoon, I received an unexpected letter. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable, Mom's carefully looped cursive, as if she were sending me a care package instead of a likely guilt trip. Against my better judgment, I opened it. The letter began predictably enough, with Mom's claims of worry and sorrow over the rift in our family, describing how heartbroken they were. She even threw in a few sentences about how they missed having me around for dinners and making the family whole. I almost laughed. They'd gone years without caring much about me, and now they were acting like my absence left a gaping hole. As I kept reading, my amusement turned to shock. Mom's tone shifted as she got to the point. She claimed that family should always support family, and that, given my comfortable situation, it was only fair for me to contribute financially to help Kyle out of his latest bind. The letter didn't just suggest, it demanded that I take responsibility, claiming I'd abandoned the family and left them in a mess. She even cited that since I'd sold the house, they knew I had extra funds to spare. The audacity was astounding. It wasn't enough for them to hound me to hand over my own home. They now wanted me to financially support the very people who tried to steal it. But the last paragraph was the real kicker. Mom claimed they'd look into legal options and that, since they were technically entitled to my support, they might see financial guardianship over Kyle if I didn't step up willingly. I sat there rereading that last line over and over. Financial guardianship. The idea that they'd even consider using the courts to force me to support Kyle was beyond comprehension. But knowing my parents, couldn't dismiss it as an empty threat. For a while, I considered simply ignoring the letter, hoping they'd realize the absurdity of their demands. But after a sleepless night, I decided to consult a lawyer. I explained the situation, from the attempted takeover of my house to the threat of financial guardianship. My lawyer assured me that unless Kyle was declared incompetent or somehow reliant on me financially, which he certainly wasn't, there was no legal basis for guardianship. Still, the lawyer advised me to keep any future communication with my parents in writing and avoid responding emotionally, no matter how provoking their demands. I felt a sense of relief knowing they couldn't legally force me to pay for Kyle's life choices, but I wasn't prepared for what came next. A few days after my lawyer consultation, another letter arrived, this time from Kyle. His tone was much angrier and far less polished than Mom's attempts at manipulation. He accused me of abandoning him and ruining his life by selling the house. According to him, the house had always been partially his, and by selling it, I'd robbed him of his rightful inheritance. His words were cutting, filled with venom. I hadn't realized he felt toward me. Reading it, I realized that Kyle truly believed he deserved everything he hadn't worked for, that my success was somehow an insult to his failures. The letter continued, blaming me for the police incident, claiming I'd driven him to that point by withholding the house. He wrote that he was struggling to get a job because of the emotional trauma of losing his home. The delusion was breathtaking. But the most chilling part was his final paragraph, where he mentioned he'd been asking around to see if anyone knew my current address. A wave of fear washed over me. I knew Kyle could be reckless, but would he actually go as far as showing up at my new place? I decided I needed to send a clear message, one that couldn't be misinterpreted. So, I wrote a formal letter back to my parents, explaining that if they attempted to seek any legal guardianship over my finances or if Kyle showed up at my apartment, I'd have no choice but to file a restraining order against all three of them. I explained that I was not responsible for Kyle's choices and that, as an adult, he was fully capable of handling his own life or dealing with the consequences of not doing so. For good measure, I had the letter notarized and sent via certified mail. I wanted them to know I wasn't playing around. A few days after sending the letter, I received a message from an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I opened it. It was from my dad, though the tone was nothing like him. He sounded defeated, claiming they never meant things to get this bad. He said they just wanted to help Kyle get back on his feet, and that if I could show some compassion, maybe we could all heal as a family. He asked if we could meet, just to talk. It was a drastic shift from the demands they'd been making, but part of me wondered if it was simply another tactic. Despite everything, a part of me still longed for some resolution, some sense of closure. I didn't want to spend the rest of my life at odds with my family, carrying the weight of resentment and anger. But I also knew they burned me time and time again, each time pulling me deeper into their mess. So, I hesitated, torn between my desire for peace and my need to protect myself. Eventually, I agreed to meet them, but only in a public place, with clear boundaries. We arranged to meet at a small cafe halfway between our towns, and I arrived early, preparing myself mentally for what would likely be a tense encounter. They showed up 15 minutes late, Mom and Dad looking worn and anxious. Hal wasn't with them, which was a small relief. Mom started off by apologizing, saying they hadn't realized how much they'd hurt me. Dad sat in silence, looking down at his hands. I listened, though their words felt hollow, like they were performing an apology rather than truly meaning it. Mom kept saying things like, "We just want what's best for everyone, and Kyle just needs a little support to get back on track." I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing at their definition of support. Finally, I cut in. "If this is going to work, I need honesty. Why is it always me you turn to for help with Kyle? Why is it my responsibility to fix his problems?" They exchanged nervous glances. Dad mumbled something about me being more independent and having the resources, but I pressed him further, demanding a real answer. Finally, Mom looked at me, a hint of desperation in her eyes. "You are always stronger," she said softly. "Kyle, he's sensitive. He needs more help, and thought you, being his sibling, would understand that." There it was, the unspoken truth that I'd always suspected. They saw me as the safety net, the one they could rely on to hold everything together while Kyle fumbled through life without consequences. I was a responsible one, the one who could handle being neglected and forgotten while he poured every ounce of support into their sensitive son. I stood up feeling a mix of anger and clarity. I'm done being the one who holds everything together. If you want a relationship with me, it can't be on the condition that I take care of Kyle. Mom started to protest, but Dad held up his hand, signaling her to stop. We understand, he said quietly, though I could see the defeat in his eyes. I left the cafe without looking back. Part of me felt lighter, but another part knew this wasn't the end. I'd finally set a boundary, but whether they'd respect it remained to be seen. Knowing them, they'd likely find another way to test it. But for now, I was free at least until the next time they decided to reach out. Update 3. Starting over, starting fresh. It's been 6 months since I left that cafe. 6 months since I set my first real boundary with my family and refused to be the one to fix their problems. It hasn't been easy, but for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm living on my terms. Right after our meeting, I decided to go completely no contact with Kyle. There was no more point in hoping he'd change or grow up. His entitled view of the world had been reinforced over a lifetime, and I wasn't going to be the one who paid the price for it anymore. I blocked his number, removed him from social media, and gave strict instructions to my parents not to mention him in any future conversations with me. If they wanted a relationship, it would have to be one without Kyle as the focal point. At first, my parents weren't thrilled. They tried reaching out through mutual friends and family members, urging me to give Kyle one more chance, but I was firm. I told them that I'd given enough chances, that I'd spent my whole life accommodating him, and that it was time for me to prioritize my own happiness. Eventually, they stopped trying, whether out of resignation or a grudging respect for my stance, I'm not sure. Either way, the silence was a relief. In the months since, I started rebuilding my life in ways I'd never allowed myself to before. I joined a local hiking group and started exploring nearby trails, something I'd always dreamed of, but never seemed to have time for. I also found myself reconnecting with friends I'd lost touch with over the years, people I'd pushed away in my constant attempts to deal with my family's endless crises. To my surprise, they welcomed me back without judgment, happy to see I was finally free of the drama that had haunted me for so long. One of the most transformative things I did was start therapy. It took a while to open up about everything: my family's favoritism, the pressure to support Kyle, the resentment and guilt that had built up over the years. But slowly, with the help of my therapist, I began to let go of the guilt and see my family's treatment of me for what it was: unfair, manipulative, and ultimately not my responsibility. Therapy has taught me that I'm allowed to set boundaries, and that doing so doesn't make me a bad person. I learned to recognize the signs of emotional manipulation, to listen to my own needs, and to prioritize my mental health without feeling selfish. For the first time in my life, I don't feel like I owe anyone an explanation for my choices. I've also made new friends, people who genuinely care about me and aren't constantly asking for favors or emotional labor. A few months ago, I met someone special through one of the hiking meetups, and we've been dating ever since. It's still early, and I'm trying not to rush into anything, but it feels good to be with someone who values me for who I am, without strings attached. My new partner knows about my family's situation, and they've been nothing but supportive. For the first time, I feel like I'm building a relationship that's rooted in respect and trust rather than duty or obligation. As for my parents, we've reached a tentative understanding. I speak to them occasionally, brief, cordial phone calls, just enough to maintain a basic connection without diving into family drama. I set clear boundaries from the beginning. Any mention of Kyle or attempts to guilt trip me would end the conversation immediately. At first, they tested those boundaries, but I stayed consistent. Now, they seem to have accepted it, and while things are still a bit strained, there's a new respect in the way they speak to me. Maybe on some level, they're finally beginning to understand the damage their favoritism has done. Or maybe they've just realized that they can't manipulate me anymore. Either way, I'm at peace with it. A few weeks ago, I found a message from my mom waiting in my inbox. It was a short, simple email, almost uncharacteristically restrained for her. She said she understood that I was happier now, that she could see I'd built a new life, and that, despite everything, she was proud of me. I don't know if she meant it, but I choose to believe she did. Maybe it was her way of acknowledging that I'd been strong enough to stand up for myself, even if it meant letting go of the family I once clung to. The truth is, I don't need their approval anymore. I don't need them to see my worth or validate my choices. I finally learned to give myself that validation, and that realization has set me free in a way I never thought possible. Life isn't perfect. I still have moments where I wonder if I did the right thing, if I should have tried harder to make things work. But then I remind myself of everything I've gained by choosing myself: peace, independence, a future that's entirely mine to shape. I don't know if I'll ever fully reconcile with my family or if they'll ever truly change. Maybe one day we'll find our way back to each other in a way that feels genuine and healthy, or maybe I'll continue on this path alone, building my life one step at a time. Either way, I'm ready for whatever comes next. This new life with all its uncertainties, feels more fulfilling than anything I left behind. And for the first time, I feel like I'm finally where I'm meant to be.